Microsoft just told its own engineers they can no longer use the best coding agent on the market, and the company that makes that agent is one Microsoft personally wrote a $5 billion check to. According to a Windows Central report, Microsoft has discontinued internal Claude Code licenses for its developers and is funneling them into the newly launched GitHub Copilot CLI. If you work inside Microsoft and you are leaning on Anthropic's terminal-based coding agent, that tap has now been turned off. To understand why this is strange, you need the full picture of how entangled these two companies actually are. Earlier this year, Microsoft put around $5 billion into Anthropic, joining Amazon and Google as a major backer of the lab. And there are ongoing reports that Microsoft is in talks to supply Anthropic with its in-house Maia AI accelerators, meaning Anthropic could end up training or serving models on Microsoft silicon. So we have an investor, a potential chip supplier, and a customer all wearing the same Microsoft badge. And that same Microsoft is now telling its own engineers to stop using the investee's flagship developer product. That is not a normal vendor relationship. That is a company hedging in three directions at once. Here is the context that matters. Claude Code, since its launch, has quietly become the coding agent that serious engineers actually pay for out of pocket. It runs in the terminal, edits real repositories, executes commands, and crucially, it has been good enough at multi-step refactors and debugging that developers compare it favorably to whatever their employer issued them by default. That default at Microsoft has historically been GitHub Copilot, and until very recently, Copilot lived inside your editor as an autocomplete companion. The new Copilot CLI, announced over the last few months, is Microsoft's attempt to match the agentic, terminal-native experience that Claude Code and a handful of competitors pioneered. Which brings us to the obvious question. Is Copilot CLI actually ready to replace Claude Code for the engineers who are using it daily? The honest answer is we do not know yet. Public benchmarks on agentic coding tasks are noisy, and internal Microsoft telemetry is not something we get to see. What we can say is that Claude Code has had a meaningful head start, and the model underneath it, Anthropic's Claude family, has consistently ranked at or near the top of the coding leaderboards for over a year. So why would Microsoft pull the plug on a tool its engineers like in favor of one that is charitably still proving itself? The most boring explanation is also probably the most correct one. Cost. Claude Code is not cheap to run at scale. Anthropic charges by token, and agentic coding is token-hungry by nature. A single complex ref factor can burn through tens of thousands of input and output tokens because the agent is reading files, planning, executing, and iterating. Multiply that by tens of thousands of Microsoft developers using it daily, and you are looking at a line item that probably has 9 zeros on it annually. Now, Microsoft is paying Anthropic, but Microsoft is also paying itself when its engineers use Copilot CLI, because Copilot runs on Azure infrastructure and, increasingly, on OpenAI and in-house models that Microsoft has commercial rights to. The unit economics of paying yourself versus paying a competitor are not subtle. There is a second motivation that is harder to quantify, but probably real. Microsoft has spent the last year repositioning Copilot as the centerpiece of its developer story, and you cannot credibly sell Copilot CLI to enterprise customers if your own engineers are publicly preferring a competitor's tool. Internal dogfooding is marketing whether the company admits it or not. And there is a third layer here, which is strategic optionality. Microsoft has clearly decided it does not want to be dependent on any single AI lab, including OpenAI, which is why we have seen the Maia chip program, the in-house MAI model effort, and now this push to standardize developers on Copilot tooling regardless of which model is underneath. That brings us to winners and losers. The most obvious loser is not Anthropic. Microsoft pulling internal licenses is a rounding error on Anthropic's revenue, which is now reportedly in the billions annualized and growing primarily through API customers and Claude.ai subscriptions. Anthropic does not need Microsoft's internal seats. It needs Microsoft's chips and Microsoft's investment dollars, both of which are apparently still on the table. The real loser, at least in the short term, is the Microsoft engineer who liked Claude Code and now has to switch. Productivity disruption from forced tool migration is a well-documented phenomenon. Even if Copilot CLI eventually catches up, the muscle memory cost is real, and you're going to see grumbling on internal channels for months. The winner, conditionally, is GitHub Copilot CLI. It just got handed the largest captive user base in software engineering and a guaranteed feedback loop from some of the best engineers in the world. If Microsoft uses that feedback well, Copilot CLI will close the gap faster than it otherwise would. If Microsoft uses it poorly, it will end up with an internally mandated tool that everyone tolerates and no one loves. The subtler winner here is the broader thesis that coding agents are becoming a commodity layer. A year ago, Claude Code felt like a genuine differentiator. Today, every major lab and every major platform has a credible terminal agent in market or in beta. When Microsoft can plausibly tell its engineers to switch, that is a signal about how interchangeable these tools are starting to look from a procurement standpoint, even if the experience still varies meaningfully day to day. There's also a Maia chip subplot worth flagging. If Microsoft genuinely lands Anthropic as a customer for its custom AI silicon, that is a much bigger deal than internal Claude Code licenses. It would mean Anthropic is diversifying away from NVIDIA and Google TPUs, and it would give Microsoft a credible third-party validation for Maia at a moment when its own internal models are not yet driving Maia volume. In other words, the licensing decision and the chip deal are probably not contradictory. They are two different transactions between two companies that have learned to compartmentalize. Microsoft buys Anthropic equity and sells Anthropic compute. Microsoft also competes with Anthropic on developer tools. Welcome to the modern AI stack, where your investor, your supplier, and your competitor are sometimes the same logo. What to watch from here? First, does Copilot CLI close the capability gap, and how fast? The honest test is not benchmark scores. It is whether Microsoft engineers stop trying to expense personal Claude Code subscriptions. Second, does this pattern spread? If Microsoft is willing to pull internal Claude licenses, expect Amazon and Google to be evaluating the same calculus for their own developer populations. Third, watch the Maia announcement. If Anthropic publicly commits to Microsoft Silicon, the strategic logic of all of this becomes cleaner. Anthropic gets compute diversification. Microsoft gets a tentpole chip customer, and the developer tool friction we just saw becomes a footnote in a much larger compute story. The headline reads like a betrayal. The reality is more boring and more interesting at the same time. Microsoft is doing what any rational counterparty would do when it holds investment, supply, and competitive relationships simultaneously, which is optimize each one independently. The engineers caught in the middle will adapt. The interesting question is whether, 2 years from now, anyone still pays a premium for a specific coding agent, or whether the agent layer has been absorbed into whatever platform you already happen to be standing on.